stress, going through the test, no access. Cause you oppressed slaves. Niggas is dying off in waves. Living in dirt, now it's a grave. Niggas cross-talk through the crosswalk or the white chalk over the bodies of roads that you paid. Americans killing us, saying they fearing us, put the drugs in the hood. Now my niggas delirious, put a gun in my face. All because of my race, click, boom, flash, for some skittles to murder my ass. Like a sheep to the slaughter, heart beating harder and harder. Baptized with these words, never dip them in water. So now we pray to the Father. Give strength to the Father that's looking for the marauder. That's fucking taking our daughters, niggas, it's wartime. Lights up, nigga, showtime. Got the green light on that ass, yeah, go time. Either boot up, shut up, get up, cause we ain't got time to be playing. It's all fucked up America. Heaven for the thief, hell for the slave. Reaping what you sow, meaning giving back what you gave for a clean slate. Try to imitate, you was always fake. America, every city, state, this is your fate. Whoa, 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 to America. 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 On the timeline, giving the rhythm to expose the intricacies of the news vibe. Doing pop, I ain't shit, but getting lit is pastime. So in a minute, I'm pass out. I hope you get it. If you didn't, you can crash flying. Kinda simple if you feel it, that's your last line. But it will confuse a bad mind. A damn shame. This the exact thing, gonna get your ass fried. Bombs from the sky, rich devil lullaby. Them the nigga fly, hope you got an alibi. Bombs from the sky, rich devil lullaby. Damn the missiles high. I can see him from the parking lot. Never finna ball out. Devils finna fall out. All out warfare, nightmares in the big house. They murdered us for years and thinking shit won't turn around. Pride never learns that this motherfucker burns down. Yelled in them streets, told them to preach. Now all of you angels bring woe to this beast. You rule for a time, but we play for keeps. I pray to my Father, bring woe to this beast. Remember them times we hung on the trees. All of you nations bow down to your knees.
Yeah, Shalom Israel.
Shalom.
We are the ISUPK out of 1 West 125th Street, New York, under commanding General Yohana. We teach the so-called blacks, so-called Hispanics, so-called Native Indians, and we are the 12 lost tribes of the nation of Israel. And tonight is an important night in the aspect of regaining our culture, our history, and our language. Alright? The Lashawan Qadash. Alright, this is where we get back, the basics of our heritage, and for us to be able to understand not just our language, but why and how and the meaning of different words in our original tongue, right? Which is the ancient Hebrew, which is the true language of the so-called black man, Hispanic man, and Native Indian man. Alright, so what we're going to do, we're just going to jump back in from where we left off last week, which will be doing the nation, or the 18 nations, alright, that the Most High have on this earth, right? Each nation has a biblical name and also what we call a modern name. Some have retained some of their names, but the majority of them have changed over time. Also, some of these nations have split or morphed into what we call separate countries. But as a nation of people, these biblical names represent those nations of people. Alright? So we're just going to jump back in to these nations specifically. Alright? I think from last week we went through about 5 or 6. Alright? So what we had last week, we did from the biblical names into the so-called modern names, or what they were today, right? Which was the so-called East Indian, who today would be known as the Elamites, right? So you had East Indians, who would be so-called Elamites today, right? They were called Elam in the ancient time with scriptures, right? Then we have Assyrian, right? Or who we call the Assyrians today, they were biblically called Asher, right? Then you have Syria, not to be mistaken with the Assyrians, right? They were Aram, alright? Then we also have the Arabs, right? The so-called Arabs, their biblical forefather was Ishmael, right? Then we have the so-called Chinese. The Chinese in the biblical text were known as Moab, or Mawa Aba. Alright? From the Chinese, we also had the Japanese. Right? So we had the Chinese, Moab, and the Japanese, Ammon. And you know the history of Moab and Ammon, where they came from. They basically descended from Lot, which was Abraham's nephew. At that time, Sodom and Gomorrah, the destruction. After that, his two daughters went slept with him, and they brought out incestuous children, what we call Mongoloids, who, as you know, which is not just my term, this is scientific. Mongoloids are basically Down syndrome people. Alright? From there, we last thing we left off on was the so-called white man, or so-called white people, whose biblical name is Esau. Right? So we have Esau as their biblical name. Esau, as we know, is the brother of Jacob. Right? As you know, Jacob, or should say Esau, when at the time of their birth, Esau and Jacob, Esau came off red all over like a hairy garment. So he was completely different to how his brother was, which was Jacob, because he was the only one worth mentioning of his description right at the time. So you have Esau. Esau, other biblical name was Edom, and there's a prophecy of him. Oh, so lucky. To what? Alright. Let's double check it and just make sure it line up properly. Just watch it and see if it line up properly. Right, so we have good. You can shift it up and
yeah, that's hardly seen your head.
Let's try back up.
Come on, so let me see. Yeah.
Good?
Yeah.
Let's double check it.
Alright, so short shift. Right, I think that's it there. Yeah, we could work with that.
So as we were saying, the so-called white man, who is biblically Esau, Edom, or Idumea. Right, so that was the area where we left off last week. So now, we're going to go to these other nations now. Now, this is one of the youngest nations that came out. Everybody, and this is who we are as a people. Right, so the name today is Israel. Biblical name remain the same. Right, we also know as 12 tribes. Or sometimes referred to as Jacob. As you know, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And from Israel, as we have he had 12 sons, which made up the 12 tribes of the nation of Israel. Right? So this was biblical name. So the Hebrew pronunciation but the Hebrew pronunciation of Israel, right, is Yah. So it's too light. So I just use the black and white. It's Yah. Yasha. Yashar. La. Yah. It's Yah-Shar-Allah, which means Israel in the ancient Hebrew. But could somebody just find the story where Jacob, when he wrestled with the angel, and he got his name, Babu Kusha. So at least we get some context of how, where, and why he got his name Israel, which is Yasha Allah in the Hebrew. So as we write it in ancient Hebrew, Yah.
From then on, Jacob would be called Israel.
Yashar Allah. So we have Yah, Shar, Allah. And that is the name of Israel, which is Prince of the Power, or Son of the Power. The prince is a son, the descendant of the power. Is that really obsession? Where he got his name changed? Go ahead. This was a name that wasn't just so we have so who is Yasha Allah today? So if we could reach down that list. So like somebody come. So we see the chart with the 12 tribes, isn't it? So we see right in the mix, right? So who is the 12 tribes of Israel today? I think we went through it all the time before, but we're just going to run through it. Yeah, go ahead.
Chapter 32 and verse 27, right? That's what it says, right? And he said unto him, what is thy name?
Right.
And he said, Jacob. Verse 28.
To what?
And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but
Right.
Israel.
So his name will be no longer called Jacob, but will be called Israel. Right?
For as a prince hast thou power.
For as a what?
For as a prince hast thou power.
For as a prince thou hast power. Go ahead.
With the Most High.
Right?
And with men.
And with men.
And has prevailed.
And has prevailed. Yeah, to what?
Verse 29. And Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, wherefore is that thou doest ask after my name?
Right.
And he blessed him there.
So basically, he just say, we asking my name for? You understand? You let him know, I don't know my name. Go ahead. That was it on that paragraph, or? Alright, no sweat. So we see where Jacob got his name changed from Jacob to Israel, which is also his biblical name. Right? As we know, you had the so-called fake Jews. Right? Those are the men, the so-called Ashkenazi Jews, so-called European, whatever you want to call them, but they are not the real descendants of the nation of Israel. And as we know, even of more recent trending on social media, we have Nick Cannon, and the whole controversy where he did this podcast saying that the so-called Jewish man is not the real Jews, that blacks are the real Jews, and also that those same Jews are savages, which he is correct to say, because we all know their history, and they try to cover that history. But again, because of the so-called love of money and power, and he doesn't want to lose his seat with the slave master, guess what? In a short space of time, he fall up after talking big, and then what? Come back and apologize to what? The same oppressor that took away our heritage, our language, and our customs. They are the greatest, that was the greatest identity theft in the entire world. That the so-called Black, Hispanic, and Native Indian man got their identity stolen by the so-called Caucasian man. You understand? Because all of them are the same family. So-called Jewish man and so-called Esau. So, and they all have their price to pay. So we have now the 12 tribes of Israel, right? Who is now today the so-called, we have Judah, Benjamin, Levi, Simeon, Zebulun, Ephraim, Manasseh, Gad, Reuben, Asher, Naphtali, and the so-called Mexicans, right? Or Issachar. So Issachar is the so-called Mexicans, Naphtali is the so-called Argentinians, Argentina to Chile, right? Asher is from Colombia to Uruguay. Reuben, the so-called Seminole Indians. Then we have Gad, which is so-called North American Indians. The tribe of Manasseh, so-called Cubans. Ephraim is the so-called Puerto Ricans. Zebulun, or Zabalawan in the Hebrew, is the so-called natives from Guatemala to Panama. Then we have Simeon, or Shaimawan in the ancient Hebrew, is the so-called Dominicans. Right? As well, we have the so-called Haitians, or Levites, which is Loya in the Hebrew, which is the so-called Haitians. And we have so-called Benjamin, or the tribe of Benjamin, which is the West Indian blacks, right? West Indian blacks, which is could be Indian or Negro, right? Like between that is the so-called, like from Jamaica, all those small islands coming on right down to Trinidad and Tobago, where we are right now, except for Cuba, except for Puerto Rico, Haiti, and Haiti and Dominica. Alright, then we have the so-called Judites, which are the so-called Black Americans. So we see where Israel got his name, or the biblical name, and who they are today. Right? And we are still in the ghettos, still in the bayous, still in every depressed state they could find. That is what the nation of Israel is. And mostly because why? We fit the curses of the Most High. Right? And we continue to see even to today. Right? Just the mere fact that Nick Cannon cave like a piece of foil. You understand? He cave like button on a hot Sunday. That is it. Can't make. Because why? He don't want to lose his seat. And it come almost the same way like how when Christ talk about, the Romans, it's better they kill one man. Because why? They don't want to lose their seat. They don't want to lose their power. They don't want to lose their money. But what will eventually happen? You try to earn only money, and guess what? They'll lose their integrity. They'll lose their soul. Now, nobody want to hear you, especially from your people. Because they realize you're weak. And the many ISUPK not weak under command in General Yan. We are not afraid to say that the Jews are black. We are not afraid to say that the white man is the devil that the Bible speaks of. Right? So if Nick Cannon had any scrotum at all, or any ounce, probably as big as a marble, then he would have been able to at least stand up and say, I stand by what I said. Now they make him the laughing stock of social media. You understand? Well, before was Jada Pinkett. Now, he till the limelight now. And that was it. So he caved down and then make a public apology to the so-called Jews and say what he was saying was anti-Semitic and not rooted in facts or some kind of something. So after you wearing this this, I don't know what you call it, this turban, something you have on your head, can't really call it a military because he ain't doing it good anyways. After you talking all this black talk, all this children of Israel, all this nice thing, all this big show, wrap up your head. Now all that gone down the drain. So which means what you really believe in was a lie. You didn't have no root in what you believe in. To cave so quickly on that one, the fear of losing money. Right? And because of that, as the scriptures say, hardly would a rich man get into the kingdom of heaven. So this is Israel, biblical name. So after that we have some other nations. Remember, it's 18 nations that were present in the biblical times. Each one had a different times of rule during that period. Right, so we just had Israel or Lashawan. So the other biblical people in the scriptures is what we would call, or who we call, the so-called Ethiopians. Right, and their biblical name would be the same, would be Cush, which would be their direct forefathers, or they were also called Ethiopians. Right? So we have now the so-called Ethiopians, right? They still hold that biblical name today, or that modern name. And the pronunciation of the Ethiopians, or Kush, which is their original name, right, is Qadash. Is Qadash. And in Egypt, right to left. Wa Sha. One is connected. So these are the so-called Ethiopians. What is synonymous with the Ethiopians, especially in the Caribbeans? What they try to ascribe to them, at least. Which is really ascribed to another group of people. But when in the Caribbean you hear Ethiopians, what's the most things that come to, what's the first thing come to your mind? Go up to the shop. Is the last eye, boss eye, turban eye, everything eye. You understand? The so-called Rastafari movement is kind of hinged on that. But we all know that whole Rastafari, the whole dreadlocks is really an East Indian culture. Right? That whole dreadlocks aspect, which kind of piggyback on the so-called Ethiopians, and they come with the so-called 12 tribes and the so-called Queen of Sheba, whole doctrine stuff that they try to put together to say, well, okay, the Ethiopians are part of the nation of Israel, or are part of the lineage of King David, or Solomon, to be more specific. Right? But as we know, the person who they put on a pedestal, who they call Selassie, right? We know he's a Cushite. Understand? He's an Ethiopian. He's not an Israelite. So because they try to mesh that now and put him as the last descendant of Solomon, they try to make him. Well, what I want to understand is that if the so-called Rastafari movement is what it is now, how come before the 1930s it didn't have no Rasta? Because if slaves come down as Rasta and all this kind of antics, because it had slaves all over the Caribbean, you hear no history about no Rasta up until when? The 1930s. And I forget the guy who really kind of pioneered that movement. I don't know if anybody can remember his name. See, maybe I can pull it up. But it was really started in the 1930s, and the whole dreadlocks aspect came in the late 1800s. I think it's after when the East Indians come here, 1845. Right, that is when the so-called East Indians come away from Calcutta, behind God, back somewhere in the back down there, where there was piss poor and starving from the British. They come here with all their doctrine, right? And that whole so-called nasty, stinking dreadlocks, which was practiced by the Niguri tribe, right? Which was a group of Hindu priests that used to do, well, they say worship the dead, if I'm not mistaken, right? So they were the ones who would practice those type of ritualistic type stuff with the dead. And not only that, guess what? They come with the dirty stinking dreadlocks. And what's the other thing Rasta famous for?
Like I said, smoking marijuana.
Smoking marijuana. It did not know marijuana before 1845 in the Caribbean. Because they come with the marijuana, they come with that. What it had on it was tobacco. And we know the Caribbean was famous for tobacco. But we know India is famous for hemp and for marijuana. So when these East Indians came down here, guess what they had? They come with the stinking dirty ras and smoking weed. Now brothers who are lost, looking for identity, they're trying to find some way out of this bondage. They see these East Indians in Jamaica smoking the weed and had the dirty dreadlocks, and they try to piece that together now with the Bible and form a new religion. And then bam, Rastafari. And the funny thing, Selassie, or who they claim is the pioneer for the Rastafari movement, he never even had dreadlocks. You understand? He never had no ras. All the pictures you're watching with him, he had no ras. And then they come with this wild story, they say, yeah, that weed going on Selassie grave and all kind of antics. That's where the weed tree come from. When you look at the history, Selassie died as a pauper, basically. If I'm not mistaken, they say some of his men actually killed him, and he was buried in some latrine hole or some kind of something. That is the kind of results, or that is the people that the Rastafari movement look up to. And everything that they look up to is false. Bob Marley, another mess. Because they have Bob Marley up on this pedestal here, and then guess what? Bob Marley is an Edomite, he's named Black. Bob Marley's father was a 61-year-old white man who was with a what? Who went and slept with a young Jamaican in her teens. Bam, they produced Bob Marley, and that was it. And because Bob Marley was in the Rastafari movement, and he started saying so-called reggae, then Rastafari movement become popular, and that is the end, basically how that so-called movement get pushed. Now you have so-called Jamaicans or so-called Rastafarians leaving the Caribbean now, going to Ethiopia to say they're going back to what? The motherland. And when they reach it, they realize it's nothing what they think about. They're still now fighting. Even Ethiopia now. We're at a civil war. And guess who killing them? The same native Ethiopians killing them same Rasta who leave where they on this side of the world to go across there now. Because why? They know that they are not the same people. And that is the position they're in right now. So these Ethiopians, who ancient name is Kush, right? And we're going to show you the judgment that Ethiopia has, or the Ethiopians, in the scripture. So I'm going to see if I can pull up that date quick. Then we move on to the next. For the Most High have a judgment. And the Most High gave a dread judgment about the so-called Ethiopians. Right? So this is Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 11. The Lord will be terrible upon them, for he will famish all the gods of the earth, and men shall worship him, every one from his place, even all the isles of the heathen. So this is a judgment going to all the heathens, to all the other nations. Right? And that judgment is even also to the Ethiopians. So this is Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 12. Ye Ethiopians also, ye shall be slain by my sword. You understand? So it's showing you that the Most High is also against the Ethiopians. And he's against the Ethiopians more so because of the way that they dealt with the nation of Israel in their time, in their rule at that time. Ethiopia or Kush is one of those African nations. So that is Ethiopians or Qadash in the ancient Hebrew. Right, so we have Kush, so-called Ethiopians. Right, so we have the others here now. We're looking in good.
Okay.
Right, so another African nation. After the Egyptians, we have the Ethiopians. We have another very famous nation, the Egyptians, right? Whose biblical name or forefather, the name of their father is Mizraim. Right? And they were also called Egyptians in the ancient as well. So the so-called Egyptians or Mizraim, right, they are the ones who had the children of Israel in the first major captivity at that time. And the pronunciation in the Hebrew is Ma to Za, Matazayam. In the ancient Hebrew, Ma, Tazar, Shalaki. It's Ma, not Wa. Ma, is Matazar Yam. Matazarium. So Matazarium is the ancient Egyptians in the Hebrew. Matazarium. Right. So, Matazarium in the Hebrew script is Matazarium. That's the Egyptians. So we have a few more. Or this way I can run these through before we go. Mic one. Okay. It's almost done now, so I'm probably not going to use somebody on to continue and follow the action. Oh. Oh, no. If not, I got to use somebody's phone. So this is the ancient Egyptians. Right, so after the ancient Egyptians, there was a whole host of so-called African nations that lived around the children of Israel at that time, or I should say in biblical times. We're going to run through a few of those as well. So another African nation is who we call today North Africa. Alright, so we had the North Africans whose biblical name was what we call Put. Regular Put is PH. Right? That's the biblical name, that's the pronunciation. We'll put it on short. Actually going here. Put. Right, and the pronunciation is Hawat in the ancient Hebrew. Yeah, to what? Yeah, to get out of extra. Yeah, to what? Yeah, I'm looking for that. Nice, to what? Alright, so the so-called North Africans is who you call Put or Pawat in the ancient Hebrew, and they also had a hand to play in our slavery at different times. And all these nations that are being called out, those who did before and those now, all these nations have a judgment to get for the hand that they had in the destruction of the nation of Israel in one way or the other. Yes, sir. Oh yeah, to what? So that was the North Africans. So after the North Africans, we have now so we have North Africa, yeah, then we have the South. Right? So we have the South Africans, and they were the famous Canaanites or Canaan. So you had the Canaan or Canaanites, and it was pronounced Canaan. I. See if I have that correct. Canaan. Canaan. In the ancient Hebrew is you have the Ka, we have the Na, I, Na. We Ka, Na, I, Na. So this is Canaan. And as you know, we had a lot of fight with the Canaanites. A lot of battles at different times in our heritage and our history with these so-called Canaanites, which are the Africans. Another group of Africans. This is primarily the South Africans, who were called the Canaanites. Canaan. Canaan. But Canaan. So you move on to the other. So you can capture these other nations. So who we have next? Right. So we have the so-called French. biblical name Gomer. Pronunciation in the Hebrew is Gamma. Gamma. And those are the so-called French. And these so-called European guys right, so that's Gomer, so-called French, the original French. And some of these names are prominent, but like Gomer is not as prominent as what their names are mentioned. But some of the others that are coming up now, you'll be able to see their names are prominent in a lot of prophecies later down in the book of Revelations. So if you have this down, this is Gomer, which is the biblical name for the so-called French. Gamma in the ancient Hebrew, and it's Gamara or Gamma in this case because of the connector. So that's Gamma or the so-called French. So after the French now, look who we have here. And their name has been, really popping up these days in the news is Russia. And Russia is the so-called name Magog. And their name is featured prominently in a lot of prophecies, especially in the end times. And we all know about the so-called Gog and Magog. So this is Magog. Pronunciation in the Hebrew is Magawag. Right? Pronunciation is Magawag. That's Magog. In the Hebrew, get this. So that's Magog or Magawag in the ancient Hebrew. So after Russia, who is so-called Magog, is featured prominently, we have the so-called another so-called European nation. They were a great powerhouse at the time they came through and featured heavily in the Maccabees. What? these were the so-called Greeks. So the so-called Greek, biblical name is Javan. Biblical name is Javan, and Hebrew pronunciation is Yawan. Yawan, that is the so-called Greeks. As you know, at that time we have so-called Alexander the Great. When he came in, he basically conquered the whole known world at that point in time. Also came down to Israel and more or less struck a deal with them. You understand? They decided to oppress us. Next thing you know, we ran out to who? Or sell out to who? The Romans. And the Romans were ruling at the time of Christ. So these so-called Greeks. After the so-called Greeks, well, when Alexander died, his kingdom split up between 4 generals, and those 4 generals went to war with each other, and the rest is history. So we have the Greeks, which is Javan. Biblical name Yawan is the pronunciation in the Hebrew, and this is the ancient Hebrew in the spelling. So after the so-called Greeks, we have the Wunderbar. I don't know what the hell that means, but they are the so-called Germans. That is their name today. But the biblical name, right, is very famous, and these were the so-called Jewish man descend from. Right? And the so-called biblical name is what we call the Ashkenaz. Right? When you hear the term Ashkenazi Jew, this is who they descend from. Right? The so-called is a Germanic tribe that at the time when you had the Crusades, you had the Muslims on one side, the Christians on one side, both of them fighting to go to the point where they would want to try to convert these so-called Germanic tribe or the Ashkenazi. Right? They say here what? Christian here, Muslim here, they will be what? A Jew. So they came and filled that void after we were carried off into the transatlantic slave trade, and our so-called heritage was so-called lost at that time. They came in and did the impersonation. And as you know, there's also scientific evidence to show that they are not the real Jews, but they will always keep that under wraps. They don't want that truth come out, because the same way how they discredit or basically put up, as we would say, Nick Cannon, because why? They don't want that history, they don't want that evidence to come out, because once it comes out that they are not the real Jews, everything that they are built on crumbles. And because of that, they will fight tooth and nail and use every trick in the book to maintain that lie that they are the nation of Israel, they are the so-called Jews. So pronunciation for the ancient name is Ashkenaz. And when you look at the Hebrew, Ashkenaz. That's it. So-called Ashkenaz, which is so-called Germans, or the Ashkenazi Jew. Alright, that so-called Hitler put to the sword in World War II. So these are the so-called Germans. Now that's where you get this whole Yiddish, that garbage of a language, trying to impersonate so-called ancient Hebrew. So they try to impersonate us. They had this whole Yiddish, this whole Assyrian Hebrew, and this Yodam, that whole mess of an alphabet that they try to use. But they are the ones who actually are in the seat of power. They own the Diamond District as well as a lot of other wealthy aspects in times now and in the past. So we go into this other nation, which is Spain, right? Right, who is also known as Tarshish. See if I get that spelling correct. Tarshish. Tarshish. And Tarshish was also known as a famous port in biblical times. Yash. So pronunciation is Yash. So that was this is the ancient, or the pronunciation of the biblical name, alright, which is Tarshish, which you have in English, but Yash is the pronunciation in the ancient Hebrew, and I'm going to write it here. Make that a little bigger. So Ra, or Rash, to be more specific. Yash. So that's it. Spain, or Tarshish, which is Yash. Yash. So that's it in the ancient Hebrew. And we have on the list here of the 18 nations. All these are mentioned in the biblical prophecies. And these are also powerful nations, featured prominently in World War I, World War II. And this other one is Italy. Right, so Italy, whose biblical name is Kittim. Kittim, that's their biblical name. Today's name is Italy. And the Hebrew pronunciation is Katayam. Katayam. So it's Yam. So the so-called Italians, their biblical name is Kittim. Then you have, which is pronounced Katayam, which is, and this is the ancient Hebrew for it, is Ka-ta-ya-ma. So it's Katam, Katayam. Alright, so this is more or less the 18 nations, the continuation of what we did last week. And these are the 18 nations in the biblical time. These same nations are here today, right? And we've seen where they are spread throughout the entire earth. All of them had different times and seasons where they ruled. I'm just bringing out the tiny biblical times to today and how these prophecies in the Bible fit up. Alright? And with that, I pass the class to Priest and Officer Barrier.
Security announcements. We are the ISUPK out of 1 West 125th Street, Harlem, New York, under Commanding General Yana. New rules for brothers and sisters. When a new brother or a sister comes into the school, they are off limits for 6 months. They are to be saluted only. They are here to shed themselves of the world. After 6 months, if a brother or a sister has an interest in a particular person, he or she must get permission from the head to speak to a brother or a sister. There is another 6 months in which the brother or sister will court each other. After the 6 months period, the brother or sister will get permission from the head to marry. Tithes, which is a commandment. You can find this in Numbers 18 and 21 and Malachi 3, 8 to 10. Means tenth in Hebrew and is pronounced Ma'ashera. 10% of every penny, of any increase the Lord gives you, you give to the Treasury Department or teacher. Priest fund, free will offering for priests, not mandatory. Whatsoever amount you would like to give. Upcoming holy convocations.
The memorial blowing at trumpets.
The memorial blowing at trumpets.
That's September the 17th.
September the 17th.
You find us in Leviticus chapter 23 from verse 24 to 25.
You find that in Leviticus 23, 24 and 25. Whatsoever amount you would like to give. Upcoming holy convocations. Remind Akium and Aquatium to check on social media such as isupk.com, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and so on for ISUPK events and materials. If a brother wants to be a trooper in the school, he is to start wearing all black, which includes black boots, like shoes, like pants, like headbands, or scarf. And with that, we say, I imagine. Let's give the teacher one courtesy salute. I imagine Shabbat. I imagine Barak.
Yahweh Hashem Yeshua Barakatah. Yahweh Hashem Yeshua Barakatah.
Yajimata. Class dismissed.